In February 2022, Russia invaded and occupied large parts of Ukraine. Suddenly, peace in Europe, which many Europeans have taken for granted since the end of World War II, was shattered. Nearly a year and a half later, no end to the Ukraine war appears to be in sight. Amidst international calls for ceasefire, China has stepped forward as a peace broker. Josep Borrell is the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Commentators call him more simply the EU's top diplomat. Borrell stepped into the hot seat in 2019 and has been the EU's point man for statements about the Ukraine war. He also sat down with China's Defense Minister, General Li Shangfu, at the recent Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, after the Chinese delegation famously refused a meeting with the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. High Representative Josep Borrell, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you.
Do you think that President Putin will listen to China, to Beijing?
If they are so friends as they claim to be, they should listen to each other, no? Keeping in mind that there are two very much different countries. China is which share of the world GDP? 20%, which is the share of the world GDP of Russia, less than 2%. So we are talking economically of a couple which are very unbalanced. Russia, it's a country, economically speaking, Russia is the same size of Italy. They have gas and they have atomic bomb.
One of the things that China has done is that it's trying to project itself as an intermediary. It's sent a representative now to Ukraine, also to the Kremlin, to try and help negotiate some kind of peace. And one of the points is that other governments must stop giving military aid to Kyiv.
Well, you know what would happen if we stop providing arms to Ukraine? That Ukraine will have to surrender. If the Russians stop fighting, the war is over. If the Ukrainians stop fighting, Ukraine is over. And we don't want Ukraine to be over. We have to support Ukraine as far as Russia continues attacking.
But is that something you think the Chinese understand?
I think every logical person understands. Every people understand that if there is not a part of a general settlement, as far as Russia continues bombing every day civilian infrastructure, killing civilians, willing to destroy Ukraine, Russia has tried to conquer Ukraine, and it has failed completely. Military is a big failure. Now they cannot conquer, they destroy. They sit on their positions and they bomb every day, everything, everybody. As far as they continue on this mood, how can we stop supporting Ukraine?
And what do you think of suggestions from commentators who say that if any kind of negotiation can take place, it will have to be with China at the table as well? Do you think that?
China has a role to play. I said that in the beginning, and I was strongly criticized when I said, look, China has a role to play here. Why? By logical reasons, because China says that they have an unlimited friendship with Russia. Well, if you see that your friend is making a mistake and going the wrong way, and you are certainly a friend, you should tell him. And he will listen to you. So China is very much influential on Russia.
What about NATO? If we look at NATO, the Russians at least, or Kremlin at least, and President Putin argue that that is the reason why they continue their invasion of Ukraine. Is that really the reason?
Well, Russia is saying that I had to defend myself because Ukraine was attacking me. When Minister Lavrov said that the other day in a meeting in India, everybody started laughing because nobody believes that Ukraine has attacked Russia. Is because Russia attacked Ukraine because Ukraine was being a member of NATO? No. There were no negotiations for Ukraine becoming member of NATO. There were no NATO troops, no NATO arms in Ukraine. And by the way, it's not NATO who is expanding. No, it's not NATO who is asking other states to be member. There are other states who want to be member because they know that Russia is a threat, and the best way of facing this threat is looking for an alliance. Look, Sweden and Finland, neutral countries. They have never been willing to be part of NATO. They are neutral. They are asking to be member of NATO. Why? Because suddenly they realize that their neighbor, Ukraine, is being attacked. And Russia could tomorrow attack them. The Baltic countries, they were knocking on the door of NATO. Please allow us to be part of the club. Why? Because we are being threatened. Because Russia invaded us in the past. Why people want to be part of NATO? Because they are feeling threat.
The Kremlin justified their invasion of Ukraine using Kyiv's moves to join the European-American military alliance, NATO, as well as Ukraine's desire to be part of the European Union. In fact, Russia demands that Ukraine remain neutral and refuse to join NATO and the EU before peace talks can even begin. Are Moscow's fears justified? The EU and NATO are two separate organizations, but there appears to be quite a lot of overlap between the two. If we look at the European Union, 2/3 of the members of EU are also members of NATO. How do the two organizations work?
Well, each one has a different purpose. NATO is a military alliance. The European Union is not a military alliance. We have 27 different armies. We try to build a kind of coordination among us. Look, for example, today all European armies are increasing their military capacity because they have seen what's happening. My message to them as representative for foreign and security policy is try to do it in a coordinated manner because we have loopholes and we have redundancies. But at the end, it will be 27 different armies. We are a peace force. We were created to make peace among us, among the Europeans. And now we want to be someone working for peace in the world.
Do you see a European army ever emerging, a united European army, where you don't have the individual countries even having their own little armies, but rather that it would be one army the way that the United States does?
Well, you know, the problem with having an army, the first question is who commands the army? If we had a single army, who would be in command of this army? If we advance on the political
Minister
union,
of Defense.
I am not the Minister of Defense. I am the one in charge of building a common defense. Common is not the same thing than unique. We could have something more or less equal to a common army. But it is not in the agenda because we have still a lot of things to do. For example, which is the most pressing thing for us to do, apart from defending Ukraine? Enlargement. There are 9 countries who are knocking at the door of the European Union willing to be members.
Including Ukraine.
Including Ukraine. But 9 members, some of them have been waiting for more than 15 years. So Europe is attracting. It must be some reason why 9 members want to be member of the European Union.
Do you think, though, that you might be forced into, or it's something that you yourself would want to as Europeans to do? Because let's look at issues like Taiwan. Recently, you also said that you thought the EU navies, they ought to patrol the Taiwan Strait to try and protect freedom of passage.
But they are doing that. There are ships from the French Navy, from the German Navy, from the Dutch Navy who are patrolling the Indo-Pacific waters. And I think it's a good idea that the European navies, plural, not the European Navy, that such thing doesn't exist, could be ensuring freedom of navigation.
Chinese commentators, though, say that while the EU or even the US say that they respect the one China policy, the truth of the matter is that in action, they want to interfere about the issue of Taiwan. And by sending ships and so on and so forth on the alleged, or at least what seems to be freedom of passage, it is really trying to interfere with China's area of influence.
No, we don't want to interfere, believe me. In international waters, you can send your ships. International waters are not Chinese waters. And secondly, we want to have trade relations with Taiwan. Taiwan is a powerhouse for technologies. We have a trade, commercial relations, investment. Taiwan has a lot of economic relations with China. Taiwan is investing a lot in China. But one thing is to have economic relations, and another thing is statehood. One China policy means that for us, Taiwan will not be an independent, fully fledged state.
So the EU wouldn't go to war over Taiwan?
It would be a world catastrophe. It would be a real world catastrophe for everybody. And I am sure that everybody understands that. And this issue has to be solved pacifically. It has to be avoid provocation. It has to be avoid moments of tensions. It has to be avoid playing war games. When I'm saying that our ships could be patrolling international waters, it's just to ensure freedom of navigation, not with a warmongering mentality. The rise of China is something natural. It's one of the biggest or the second biggest country in the world. We exchange every day almost $3 billion of trade. Every day, 2,000 ships are going to China and from China. Our firms have a lot of activities. We are commonly interested on having a good relationship.
How would you describe that relationship between EU and China?
Very much interlinked. Very, very much interlinked.
That doesn't sound very friendly when you say very much interlinked. That just sounds like a rather economic and transactional relationship.
It's economically and technologically, we are certainly very much interlinked. Our societies are not enough interlinked. And I really would like to be more engaged with the Chinese society.
But can the EU have an EU-China policy that is independent and separate from America's?
Europe has to have its own policy for everything. You know, we will always
From the outside, it looks very similar, though.
Different doesn't mean its own policy doesn't mean it has to be by nature different. We will be always closer to Washington than to Peking. Always. We share the same political system, multi-party competition instead of a single party. We share the same economic system, market economy, not a state-controlled economy. So it's clear that we will be, our links, family, human, between Europe and US will be always bigger than with China.
But doesn't that build that Western bloc, bullying Western bloc narrative that China argues? It makes it look as if the West is a yes, as if it were a bloc, exactly, which is somehow very often how it comes across as well. Here in Asia, we often talk about the West.
Yes.
As if it was a unified bloc. But you're saying it's not. There are shared values, but somehow there are shades.
What is a bloc? What is a bloc? The Soviet Union was a bloc. Because like or not, you had to obey Moscow. The West is not a bloc. Each country is an independent, free, sovereign country. There are elections. People can choose their government. Some government will feel closer to the government in Washington. It will depend also on which government will be in Washington. We feel closer to Washington today than some years ago when it was another president. So I resist the temptation of talking the West and the rest. It's too simple. And when things are too simple, they are fooled.
An unexpected knock-on effect of the war in Ukraine is that the European Union's more than 400 million citizens have turned from traditionally somewhat skeptical about the bloc to ardent supporters. Recent polls now show an overwhelming majority of EU citizens back the EU's massive financial, military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But how long will this fervor last? Do you think that Europeans may at some point get tired of the war in Ukraine? You yourself have said that actually the amount of money spent, if you take into account how much European governments have had to give to their citizens to try and ameliorate inflation and all the other things that are the sort of spillovers of the war, that it's as much as 700 billion euros. How long will Europeans be willing to bear that cost, emotionally and also opening their doors to refugees, the money? How long will this be something that they'll be willing to do?
Now, Putin believes that democracies are weak and democracies get tired. Democracy is in a state of public and free opinion, that people will reject supporting charges, sacrifices and cost. And he is waiting for that. He is waiting for us to say, okay, that's enough. Why should we support in Ukraine? It's very costly. And certainly it's costly. But, you know, it's not something that we do just because we love Ukrainians and we are generous. It's because also a challenge and a threat for us. So I think there is the need for a political pedagogy that each one of the political responsible persons, men and women, in Europe has to do to explain to our citizens what's happening, which are the causes, which are the consequences, and why we have to support Ukraine. Even if it, you know, freedom has a price. It has always had a price.
How many years? It's already been almost a year and a half. Another year? Another 5 years? Another decade?
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But what can for sure can tell you, Putin believed when he started the war that the war was going to last 2 weeks. He started the war because he believed that in a couple of weeks his army would be in Kyiv. They will put a puppet government. Ukraine will be a second Belarus. Ukraine will no longer be free people. And he will grasp another part of the former Russian Empire. And 1.5 years later, Russia has lost almost 2,000 tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers. The Russian army has been rejected. Russia, morally, politically, has already lost this war.
So you're saying there is no limit, no time limit at least, to the EU's support for Ukraine?
Once again, the word never, in politics, don't use the word never. But I think, honestly, there are strong reasons, not just economic reasons, moral reasons, and political reasons for the Europeans to support Ukraine and to try to convince the rest of the world, the so-called global south, that it is on their interest too to build a world where the power is not above the law, that a power country can invade a neighbor, a weaker neighbor, and to bring them to a kind of political dependency. Because if this happens with Ukraine, which will be the next one?
Final question, High Representative. Some people say that there are parallels between ASEAN and the EU. What would you say to a Southeast Asian to convince them that actually a structure like the EU, which is not what the ASEAN has at the moment, could actually bring greater wealth or greater security?
I think regional integration is good per se, because barriers, borders, are something that at the end are obstacles. Obstacles to trade, obstacle to mutual knowledge, obstacle to economies of scale. You know, the borders are the scars that the history has been writing on the skin of the earth. And the less borders, the better. Understanding that there are identities, there are culture, there are history, and people want to be what they are, that sometimes some nations are threats to others, that others has to be aware of the risk, that we don't agree on everything. In some cases we disagree strongly, but the way for the future of humankind is erasing borders. And the big advantage of Europe is that we have been erasing borders. You know, I can go from Gibraltar Strait to the Arctic Pole, going through 20 European countries without having to show a passport, without nobody ask me who you are, where you're going, what is in your wallet. When I was a boy, if I want to go out of Spain, I had to queue in the border. A long queue, showing the passport, opening the wallet. And it was so difficult to travel among us that today it looks like a miracle, the fact that 500 million people with a lot of different languages can travel around and stay and work wherever they want without having to ask permission.
That's the European Union miracle you're selling.
This is one of the merits of the European Union, certainly.
High Representative Josep Borrell, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you.